Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternet. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
It's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes said,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
Hello there. Good conversation today on the podcast, the eponymously named podcast. We got that one in early, known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. I have had the great opportunity, it was so much fun, to follow up our great Star Trek conversation of last week with the one and only David Grevin. That was just so much fun talking about race, gender, and sexuality in the Trek mythos. So appreciated David sitting down. And I mentioned Brother Adilifu Nama last week. He was the author of several books on race, popular culture. He and I chopped it up for this episode. Again, so much fun, a lot of laughter. I mean, sometimes brothers from another mother walking the same path. He was like Red Man and not Method Man on this one, talking about race on the color line in science fiction. He's the author of a great book called Black Space. So he had the twofer there on science fiction. And Adilifu, man, he was just so cool. I mean, we touched on a lot of different topics and conversations. We talked about our favorite horror movies. I won't give that one away. Going to the comic book store, we talked about writing, reading, and thinking in a serious and professional way about science fiction and race. And it was just, as he says, kismet. I learned a new word. I guess that's Yiddish. Kismet. I'll be using that one much more often in the vocabulary. Had a really interesting week too. Sitting here, I was on Ring of Fire Radio and TV on the Free Speech Network. Always giving love to them with guest host Farron Cousins. And that was last week. He and I talked about Ferguson, the report from the Department of Justice about the Michael Brown shooting, and also the rampant and insidious white supremacist day-to-day quotidian with institutional and personal racism as a matter of policy by the Ferguson police and their debt peonage collection racket scheme against the good folk of that community. So that was always a pleasure. And a few folks have emailed me to say, hey man, don't be too nervous. Don't be too self-effacing, because whenever I go on the TV machine or via these internets and direct TV and other outlets, I'm always worried about how I look. And I said, man, I look like I got jaundice. And we had some gremlins in the system. I'm a perfectionist. We had a bit of lag. I mean, we got this futuristic Star Trek-like technology, but sometimes it's a millisecond off. So I'm sitting there watching myself saying, man, we're doing some good truth telling, but how come I'm out of sync? How come I look like I got jaundice? So we're working on getting those gremlins out. And speaking of gremlins, you're going to have to suffer through a very quick rant before we get to the good stuff with Brother Adilifu Nama about race and sci-fi and the color line. Man, I finally gave in. I was talking to my man, Bill the Lizard. He's been on the podcast before. Fellow life partner, my heterosexual life partner, as we joke in the Kevin Smith sense. And I finally went out after seeing that appearance, and I said, I'm going to get myself a new webcam. I'm going to get one of these HD webcams so people can see me in my beautiful and normal self. I think my best in terms of appearance, redundant there, was on the big picture and the RT network. I was like, that's not a bad looking man. The goatee was looking good. The hair was looking tight. So I go out and get this fancy camera. And of course I make sure about the return policy. And I tell the man, I was like, hey, you're going to have to price match this camera. And if it's not better than the one I've got, I'm bringing it back. And he was like, cool, no problem. So, big ups to the manager, as we used to say back in the day, at Office Depot. So I get the camera, try to hook it up. Lo and behold, the dang computer won't acknowledge it. Turn the computer on, turn it off, go online, look to see what the heck is going on. Quite literally, I spent, and you can hear the annoyance in my voice, about 6 hours trying to fix this dang thing. On the telephone. Then, I find the phone number for these people. I won't name the company. I call them up, and of course, I'm rerouted to somewhere in another part of the world where our jobs have been outsourced. Some nice person in South Asia somewhere. It was very helpful, but after 2 hours on the phone with her, no conclusion except her repeating to me all the things I have done that I found on their forum. And I said to the young lady, I've done all these things. I know you're sitting in front of a computer reading off a screen. Don't you have some expertise on the matter? Man. So lo and behold, she comes up with this absurd suggestion to fix this camera. You can hear it. I'm sure you've all been there with his tech support people. That I should go and roll back Windows and reinstall it. I said, I am not reinstalling Windows and all these programs to get a camera that costs $100 to work. I said, out of the known universe of users of your product who also use Windows, someone must have called you up to resolve this problem before. No answer. So then I got the bright idea. I said, I'm not going to go and roll it back and reinstall. This Windows 7 Professional has this feature where it saves all the installs and all these horrible updates you get. So another 2 hours later, I quite literally uninstalled every patch from the last 3 months. And it was a curse, this cursed hotfix patch from Microsoft that made the camera not work. Now my other dilemma is, and I finally got the camera to work, and I'm looking at it, and I was doing my little testing. We built a lizard online. We tried Skype, Google Chat, Google Hangout rather. And he's like, man, that's a good camera. Actually, looks like you're on video. But you can see all the gray hairs. And now he's got me worried. Now, what am I going to do? Do I take the camera that's less than 1080 HD because it make me look a little more flattering? Or do I accept the fact that this camera will show me in all my glory? So I don't know. So there's your tech support rant. And here's the funny thing, too. I was also thinking about Marx and his prescient observations about capital and labor. And I was sitting there on this phone saying, Marx underestimated how portable capital and labor was. That all these jobs have been outsourced all over the world and we're interconnected. But these jobs used to pay Americans a good sum of money. And now they've been outsourced to somebody making it $2 an hour. They're new middle class. Man, when you actually know what's going on, it is head shaking in its consternation. So there's my rant and also some love to Ring of Fire because I think we did some real cool stuff. Me and Ferran Cousin sitting in for Mike Papantonio talking about Ferguson. Speaking of Ferguson, I've been writing a lot about that on the website. I'm sure folk are getting frustrated. Like, why is this Negro still talking about Ferguson? I'm talking about Ferguson because it's important, number one. And we need to think systematically about power. We need to have systems level thinking. I know we are in a drive-by media moment where people have limited attention spans, but Ferguson is central. And speaking of the centrality of Ferguson for the moment and how some folk are either loath to talk about it or having a mea culpa moment because the DOJ report on Michael Brown, to their eyes, was less than flattering to the hands up narrative. I have finally been blocked by somebody on Twitter. I felt like a tween. I was like, why are you blocking me? That's not nice. So, one of the writers at the Washington Post, last name Capehart, you can guess the first name, had a piece he wrote about black respectability politics, and sometimes you have to say, I'm sorry. And he said, the fact of the matter is Michael Brown, more or less, got what was coming to him. We latched onto a false narrative. Darren Wilson more or less told the truth. Now, here's my problem with that, because you got another flip side to this, and I've written about this on ChaunceyDeVega.com. I alluded to it with Ferran Cousins. Number one, how can you have documented institutional white supremacy by the police department, but not fault somebody within that department in terms of their behavior? Michael Brown did not deserve to die for supposedly, quote unquote, stealing $10 worth of cigarettes. Come on. Or cigarros, whatever those, blunts people use to smoke weed. That's number one. And nowhere in these, noble Negro of the day narratives, because he's not the only one who's done this. And I do think it's sincere. And Ta-Nehisi Coates did it, and I think in a different way, where he quickly pivoted to talking about the institutional questions at play, just like I did. I wrote something up here on ChaunceyDeVega.com as well. I was like, hey, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, but I'm not apologizing for a dang thing. I'm not going to be the noble Negro who deals with folks who approach justice and the color line and human rights with ill intent and who are disingenuous. Number one, you got the context issue. Number two, you have the interesting question about Mr. Darren Wilson, who was kicked out of a police department or resigned from a police department that was shut down for racism in a municipality right near Ferguson. You have the very basic question about justice and transparency. That's all people wanted was a trial. And you don't have anybody, and I alluded to this repeatedly on the website, talking about Darren Wilson's testimony where he said Michael Brown was a feral, demonically possessed beast. What does that say about this man's state of mind? I mean, so many questions. So you have the noble Negroes and others on the quote-unquote left, although there is no real left in this country in terms of the mainstream, who are doing their mea culpa. Oh my God, we were sorry, we were wrong. How could we have latched onto this narrative? We were hoodwinked, bamboozled, tricked, confused. I wouldn't even dare to try to channel brother Malcolm there in his actual magisterial and masterful tone. But then you got the other side of the swerve. You've got these conservatives. I think a gentleman writes for Red State America, and he basically wrote an editorial that's got him lots of heat, saying, why aren't conservatives keying in more on the DOJ report that talks about racism in Ferguson by the police? Is this not an example of big government in the worst sense? Tyrannical government run amok? Why are we silent? Now, the answer is pretty damn simple, because conservatism and racism in the post-civil rights era are one and the same thing. That's why it's their brand name. Why are they going to talk about injustice by the police against black people when hostility and anti-black animus is centrality to the white right wing and the black conservatives who are part of them, who are in bed with them, who are hanging out at that public urinal, that trough urinal as I like to call it, is Uncle Tom's, letting themselves be abused and used, to how they mobilize white opinion, to, as I said, their name brand. And white conservatives are not going to speak out against a tyrannical police department that is shaking down black people when they support the prison industrial complex, when they want black people to be shaken down, harassed, and subjected to unnecessary and unwanted and unwarranted violence. That existential state of violence against the black body is central to the post-civil rights era, and we could even go back before that, white American conservative imagination. So we can have a whole debate about principle conservatism versus conservatism in practice. Right now, the principles of mainstream conservatism are anti-black and brown racism. So of course they're not going to say a dang thing. So we got the two hands, right? We got the black folk on the quote-unquote left trying to be sensible and reasonable, talking about one of the reports, i.e. the report about Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, and then you have one or two folk on the right saying, man, how come we're not talking about the institutional racism part and we're all caught up in trying to defend the Negro bounty hunter, Darren Wilson, who got his blood money, hundreds of thousands, if not more than $1 million. Who knows what sacks of money were brought to him in private, so that too many white folks can engage in sort of history, can engage in hero worship and idealization and ideation of a man just like George Zimmerman, just like so many others, who fulfilled a fantasy of killing black people. There's your real talk for the moment. That's just straight talk. And that's what you get here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, where we sit down with interesting and smart people doing interesting and smart things. And Adilifu Nama certainly is one of them. So, another observation, as I said, always trying to speak truth to power, and always trying to do a little teaching, as we try to do here on the podcast. I have a little smirk on my face. I was reading about again, it's not funny, it's sick, it's sad. Once and again, you have a white man, right-wing domestic terrorist, a neo-Nazi, goes on a shooting spree in Arizona, kills at least one person, hurts 5 others, wounds them seriously. And where are the white people? The white opinion leaders condemning this behavior? Where is the national conversation about what the heck is going on with white men and guns and sacrificing our kids to Moloch? And again, you see these white men going on these shooting rampages, killing people. And if you dare to bring up the connection between race, masculinity, whiteness, and gun culture, you will be shouted down. Because, of course, there's something called black crime, but there's no narrative in our language for white criminality. So I alluded to the brother's writings before. See, that's me scratching the goatee when I get ready to read a little quick thing. And no, this is not going to become a podcast where I read to you every week. That's just every now and then when I have an animal story that moves me, or something that I simply can't paraphrase. But I'm getting my reading voice ready very quickly, thinking about this neo-Nazi skinhead. And again, Ring of Fire, talked many times, written about many times about white right-wing domestic terrorists, Southern Poverty Law Centers, and others that, hey, 9/11 happened, but since 9/11, there's been white men who are out in these streets killing people. They're the threat that you need to watch out for. And we saw how the Republicans and the mainstream media responded to that, my goodness, that horrible suggestion that the FBI actually needs to be monitoring these folks, because I'm sure they are, the Cliven Bundys and others of the world. So, I've mentioned him before. You hear me turning the pages here as I find my space. One of my favorite satirists, one of my favorite satirical writers, African-American. You can try to find his stuff online. You hear me turning the pages here, getting out the yellow sticky tape. Because, when you're writing and you're trying to save things, you put the yellow sticky tape on the book chapter. So there's a wonderful, wonderful collection of essays called Black on White, Black Writers on What It Means to Be White. And this is edited by brother David Roediger. Go get him on the podcast. Hook or crook. I love his work. I met him a few times. Great scholar. I'm sure some of you have read Wages of Whiteness or otherwise heard about it. If you have not, you should track it down. So, one of my favorite essays is called What Shall We Do with the White People? Now, this was written under a pen name, Ethiop, by William J. Wilson. And I'll just read you the little header here in the collection. Signing himself as Ethiop, the Brooklyn school teacher, William J. Wilson, 1818 to whenever, ? Maybe he's still alive. Maybe he's an immortal. Maybe he's a Highlander. Wrote many articles for Frederick Douglass's paper and for the Anglo-African magazine in the 2 decades before the Civil War. In one extended fantasy, he imagined a future in which African Americans looked back during the year 4000. See, sci-fi is everywhere. Speculative fiction is everywhere. Black folks are dreamers. And that's why we need to expand the sci-fi canon to include folks like Ethiop William Wilson and, of course, Schuler and so many others. So, reaching back, or rather look back during the year 4000, recalling their former oppressors, now extinct, as milk-white beings who were quote-unquote terrible to look upon, ye even fearful. In the remarkable 1860 Anglo-African magazine article reprinted below, Wilson's concerns are largely with past and present, though he raises large questions concerning the future. So I'm obviously not going to read the whole thing, but it's just priceless, beautiful writing. And no, this is not an anti-white rant from Chauncey DeVega. Of course not. Race is a social construct. This is about imagination. This is about power. This is about language. This is about expanding the sci-fi canon. And I think a lot of our white brothers and sisters don't understand that black and brown folk, those who are on the other side of the color line, just like women, just like gay and lesbian folk and others, we understand the in-group more than the in-group understands itself. That's a matter of life survival. So when you have these moments where the white gaze realizes that, yes, it is being studied in reverse, these are ideologically disruptive moments for whiteness. Very, very important. Whiteness does not like to imagine itself, number one, as existing, and two, its owners, members, practitioners, and others as being, number one, psychologically invested in whiteness and materially invested in whiteness, but being objects of study. You see, that's the relationship, subject and object. And when you flip it, that's an ideological disruptive moment and a very challenging one. But I'll just read the opening paragraph, and there's one part at the end that's just so awesome. You got to read it and you got to listen to it. So this is a grave question, and gravely will we attempt to consider it. But before entering upon the discussion, a brief outline of the rise and career of this people in this country may be necessary. For many centuries now have they been on this continent, and for many years have they had entire rule and sway. Yet they are today no nearer the solution of the problem. Quote, are they fit for self-government than they were at the commencement of their career? Discontent and disaffection have marked every footstep, and the word failure is today written on every doorpost. They came over to this country in the first instance in small numbers, and forthwith began upon a course of wrongdoing. The Aborigines were the first victims of their cupidity. They took advantage of them in every conceivable manner. They robbed them of their lands, plundered their wigwams, burned their villages, and murdered their wives and children. This may seem overdrawn, for in some instances small purchases of land were made. But this was merely for the sake of foothold, a kind of entering wedge. When once gained, the work of ravage and devastation would commence. Thus, step by step they advanced, until now they have almost the entire possession of the continent. That's my, radio 20th century yellow journalism voice. I hope you like it. So skipping ahead, as I said, so many genius moments here from Ethiop. I'm just trying not to laugh as I read this. This is priceless stuff here. We have perhaps been too modest, else we would have raised the question before, and might, it may be, ere this, have found its proper solution. Let us endeavor to compensate for past neglect by an earnest endeavor to settle this important question. But before proceeding to the answer, we find another and equally vital question forcing itself in our way, which demanding a moment's attention. What is the cause of all this discontent, this unquiet state, this distress? This answer, we think, may be found in this: a long-continued, extensive, and almost complete system of wrongdoing. Like a man who commences the life of a pickpocket and changes not his way, becomes not only an adept in the profession, but a hardened offender, and reaps the bitter fruits in the end thereof, so also this people. They commenced with the plunder of the Indian, theft of the African, followed by the grossest wrongs upon the Afro-American, and broils with their neighbors without, and stripes among themselves within, the fruits of which are thorough disaffection and agitation. And Ethiop concludes, just again, smiling and grinning as we think about what shall we do with the white folks in these moments of white right-wing domestic terrorism. Seriously, do we hope that if the peace of the country is to be so continuously disturbed that they would withdraw? We have arrived at a period when they would easily be spared. We have ceded to these people energy and force of character. And we may add one another characteristic, a roving, unsettled, restless disposition. They are an inclination, if not habit, marauders. It may be, unless we find some other effective means of adjusting existing difficulties, that from this point we may have some hope for their exodus. We give them also high credit for their material progress. Who knows, but that some day when, after they shall have fulfilled their mission, carried arts and sciences to their highest point, they will make way for a milder and more genial race, or become so blended in it as to lose their own peculiar and objectionable characteristics. In any case, in view of the existing state of things around us, let our constant thought be, what for the best good of all shall we do with the white people? I'm just being mischievous. That was awesome. Self-congratulatory. That's the joy and fun of having a podcast, and having a great podcast with great guests, with cool listeners, and wonderful, smart people who agree to share their time here on the podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show. And again, that was Ethiop. And Ethiop is obviously, of course, playing with the language and rhetoric of white supremacists of the 19th and 20th century. And even before that, who were actually saying the way to solve the race problem is to send black people back to Africa, recolonization, get them the hell out of this country. So I love that genius wit there and just the tone in the language. And that begs the question, man, what has happened with language? God, what has happened with language? And I fundamentally reject, certainly his book on hip hop is just horrendously bad. And a lot of his cultural analyses is just substandard and piss poor. But he's a very, 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 very smart man, Mr. John McWhorter. And his writings on sociolinguists and language it's just amazing stuff. And he has a great book where he actually looks at letters written during the Civil War, and he tries to ponder what has happened in terms of the evolution or devolution of the English language in the West, especially in America. So check that book out too. So Adilifu Nama, as I said, he's their guest. You had the promo, you had a fun observation, you had a little reading there from, again, the sci-fi tradition of speculative fiction. Because sci-fi is not just robots, aliens, time travel, space. It can also be the counterfactual. I mean, it's inherently political, and it's a space for imagination and for dreaming and for speaking back to power. And people of color, women, gays, lesbians, so many folk who are the outgroup have used sci-fi. And also a lot of white brothers who were writing in a very narrow tradition where they could not talk explicitly about race and get published or get, a deal for a Twilight Zone episode. They had to use robots. They had to use aliens. They had to use the metaphor. So Adilifu Nama, author of Black Space, professor, fellow professional ghetto nerd. Man, we go to some fun places here. And that's all I've got to say. And I also want to give a shout out and some love to a kind supporter of the podcast, Mr. Chauncey DeVega Show. He threw some ducats in, or Latinum as we say, to support the podcast going forward because he got so much out of the Star Trek conversation. He's been a friend of ChaunceyDeVega.com since the beginning. So much love out to him. I will allow him to stay anonymous. We know him. He is a Black Romulan. So without further ado, Adilifu Nama, race, the Colorline, sci-fi, jokes about comic book stores, our favorite horror movies, of course, Dracula, talk about Frankenstein, but we also talk about the new age horror movies, such as Precious and The Blind Side, pathology porn, and we have just a wonderful to and fro about Django and race and memory, and also thinking about sort of the existential dilemma, as Adilifu Nama puts it so brilliantly, about blackness, about race, about identity, about our personhood, about our being, about dreaming. And we also talk too about teaching and the classroom and call and response. So, and I think and I know you're going to love and enjoy and learn from this edition of the Chauncey DeVega Show. What are you teaching right now?
Well, I'm teaching, LMU University, of course, but I'm teaching a class on Black cultural arts. Primarily, I'm dealing with the Black aesthetic. And then the other course I'm teaching is on race and cinema, race and American cinema.
How'd you decide, because I'm struggling with this, I teach courses in film too, and I'll share what happened in my class the other day. You can give me a little pep talk.
Okay.
Because again, showing love, I love your book, Black Space.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
When I read that, it was the answer to an intellectual prayer I'd been struggling with. And it was really, really, really helpful in my own writing. So I want to give you love for that. So of course we'll talk about Black Space, your other two books. Your new book is going to be on Tarantino and Django, correct?
Right. Well, it's called Race on the QT, Blackness in the Films of Quentin Tarantino. I take all of his Tarantino's films to task, and not so much to task in terms of Tarantino's been a bad boy, but more or less I take the task for what I see as the radical racial politics that his films have. Too often they're, dismissed in terms of, just an ode to, the worst of blaxploitation cinema. One could say that, or they just get caught up in the whole hyper-violence spectacle that is a Tarantino flick. And we don't get to some of these more, I think, subversive, radical racial politics that are coursing throughout his films. Not to say that all of them are masterpieces of racial progressive positions. My argument, at least in the book, particularly, is a lot of this, has to be dealt with in a certain way, and people are kind of missing the point.
I had an opportunity to talk with a really cool brother. His name is M. Lamar. He's a performance artist. His sister is on the TV show Orange is the New Black.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's cool as hell. And we talked about art and his work and the New York Times piece. We spent a lot of time talking about Django and phallocentrism and America's obsession with black men's penises.
Yeah.
And he and I were talking about, it was fascinating, again, to talk to a fellow traveler who's thinking about these issues, about the castration anxieties and castration fantasies in Django.
Yeah, it's got a lot of uptight pieces in it, man, to be quite frank with you. What I'll say is that, there's multiple readings you can have on film. My reading of Django is going to be maybe on another wavelength, but that does not in and of itself, it doesn't dismiss or invalidate other readings of the flick that may have a different take or a more harsher, hard line to make. You know what I mean? So, like for me, Django, first of all, Django is about racial anxiety. More specifically, and I write about it in the book, I see Django more as a gothic horror film and less of a spaghetti western. I think there's a little bit of a bait and switch there. And the reason I say this in terms of the gothic horror piece is that, I don't know if you recall in the film, the scene where little Jody is being tied to the tree because she's broken some eggs. And
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so I think it's one of the Brittle brothers is about to whip her. The setup is, it's quite unbelievable, really. If you look at it, I mean, you've got Django in this little boy blue, electric blue suit. The way he's come onto the plantation, it's almost as if he doesn't really exist, in the sense that he walks by other enslaved Africans who are kind of like this twiddly-dee, twiddly-do. They're just kind of like lackadaisically going through the motions of their life. They never really kind of like look up to him. And so it's a real surreal, and many, the critics earlier were like, this is unbelievable. This is not real, But there's a setup in that scene where there's a big mirror on the set to the side, the staging ground where Jody's about to be, whipped. And in the scene, there's a cutaway to Jody looking at the mirror at the reflection of Django. Well, if you look at that scene, go back and check it out. Django does not cast a reflection. You only see his clothes.
Wow.
Yeah. There's no head, no hands. You cannot. Only thing that stands out in the reflection is the suit. So right there, Tarantino, in my mind, this is how I read the film, he's telling you, the film is telling you, Django he's an apparition. He doesn't exist. He's an urban folk tale.
Yep, he's a legend.
He's a legend come to life, right? He's not real. And therefore, he's a specter, apparition, something that's talked about and imagined about, and even, the hyperbole of it, of Django, right? That this is almost like someone's telling you the story about this is what he did, which, in reality he didn't do, but in terms of the folklore of it, the frightening nature of it, this is what he does, right? And so the apparition, the specter of him becomes kind of like the return of the repressed. This is white fear of this black avenger coming through to do what should be done, and he does it. And so those type of things speak to another type of genre, because the gothic film, the gothic horror film, gothic literature deals with the absurd. It deals with introducing humor into scenes and scenarios that you feel aren't quite appropriate. It deals a lot with skulls and and corpses, mirrors and demons and spectral images that don't have reflections. And also you see in the film his wife, Broomhilda, right? I mean, she's this living ghost, right? That popping up. And then there's a damsel in distress. I mean, there's all of these signifiers of that this film is more about horror and taking a lot of its cues from the Gothic, more so than it is even the spaghetti western.
I mean, and we're thinking similar things. I mean, we must be royal pains in the butt to go to movies with.
Yeah.
Because I know folks will be like, that's why I go to the movies by myself, because for me it's a critical text. And I'm going to see it again and again and again and think about these questions of genre. And one of the hardest things to communicate with friends who are interested in films who no longer want to go to the movies with me is that a movie is an ideological text.
That's right.
And it can be mixed.
That's right.
And that you have to think about genre and style and intentionality. Tarantino is an amazingly literate filmmaker.
Oh, yeah.
And he's amazingly intentional and wonderfully intertextual.
Yes.
All right. So a lot of alliteration there. I guess that's an example of alliteration. So I didn't think about the Gothic angle because my read of the film is it's many things, But first and foremost, my claim would be it's a fantasy of black revenge for colorblind liberal white people.
Okay.
because they read themselves into this fantasy as they're the Martin Luther King character. They're M. Schultz.
Right.
And then when you look at the caricature of the white slave owner, I wrote about this on ChaunceyDeVega.com, that's a caricaturized version of white monstrosity. It's grotesque. When the real history is a lot scarier when you read great books like Minds of a Masterclass, or when you read some of the texts that collected the journals and diaries of these white slavers.
Right.
Yes, some of them were monsters, but some of them were just the banality of evil.
Right.
And they were just making money, and they were going to do, it was a factory. The plantation was run as a workhouse, as a factory.
That's right.
And to me, that's a lot scarier.
This brings me to another point that I really wanted to highlight. Now, I've always been, I was thinking about what I was going to say and how I was going to say it. And one of the things I really took time to kind of like ruminate on was that I wanted to just dap you up and give you my deep appreciation for your writing and for your blog. And there's very few blogs that I'll read, or that maybe I'll read more, but ones that I actually say put on my list of like, I've got to go check in and see what's going on. Yours is right up there at the top of the list. And I'll call them out. It's yours, Coates over there at the Atlantic. Is it Ta-Nehisi or Ta-Nehisi? Do you know?
Ta-Nehisi, yeah.
Ta-Nehisi, there we go. And my name's Adilifu, right? Ta-Nehisi.
Ta-Nehisi, Adilifu and Chauncey. Sounds like a joke or a band.
Right. And Mark Anthony Neal's Black Man, New Black Man. Like some key blogs that I will come to. Racialicious is another one. So I'm trying a couple of shout outs. But most importantly, Ego Tripland, and many of these you have already highlighted as people I should check out anyway. But I just want to just really send a shout out, and the reason I'm taking time to say this, because I think it's so important in the way in which we were just having this conversation about Django, but yet you're able, and this is a rare thing. This is why I enjoy so much reading and dealing with your blog. Is that you'll have these links to, you said, was it Mind Over Matter? What was the,
Minds of a Masterclass. And if you haven't read it, you got to check it out. Right? It's disturbing.
Right. So I'm a decently read cat. I'll get out here.
3 books and 10 years. You're doing pretty damn well, man.
I don't get out as much as I used to, man. You know what I'm saying? But I can always count on you to be the cat who will bring in these real serious, for real pieces that I can go and backtrack on and find out different information and be exposed to, man. And I just really want to take the time, man, just to really say how much I appreciate that. Because in many ways, I don't have time to, I would love to have what it's called, devote my time to the life of the mind. Mm-hmm. But I got life of kids. I got life of bills. I got just the life of just trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. And in that process, man, it is like really a gift to be able to go to your blog, a writer, particularly, and I'm going to double dap you up, a writer who's able to have a perspective that is right there. I mean, you put it out there. It's one of the best things about, writers that I appreciate and respect is honesty. And even if wherever you come out on the spectrum in terms of like, how much I agree or disagree, the honesty I really appreciate, man. And so the only other cat I know who kind of like does this type of like the homework of writing, in terms of not only having the issue distilled down to something potent, but the able to back it up, is another one of my favorite writers, Ishmael Reed. He's another guy who keeps tabs on where all the bodies are buried, And so I enjoy, your blog for that. And so when you drop this thing about Django and then able to link it up to these other pieces, and man, that to me is brilliant. So I wanted to say that for the record, man.
Oh, wow, man. And you mentioned me with some great folk. And I'm going to leave this in. I won't edit that out.
That's the
positive energy. That's the positive energy that keeps you going. And as I said, I really admire your work, too. So we're not blowing smoke up each other's behinds. We're being real. I mean, your work is awesome, too.
I appreciate
and never diminish it. But, I mean, Ishmael Reed, is just a legend.
Yeah.
You know, and he's just right to the point. And my policy has always been, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, I always give respect to him because he added, when I first started this years ago, he added the website to his blog roll.
Okay.
And that really helped get attention for it. So I'm hoping that he stays at the Atlantic for a long time.
Yeah.
But it seems like he's probably moving on to other things.
Yeah, no, I think this cat, man, is like one of the, for me, he's like, you know, if this was like a jazz day, he'd be like the young lion. You know what I'm saying? Young lions, like, you know, some cats who's like, breaking out. And that last piece he did on, like, I think it was like on reparations.
Yeah.
Oh, man, that for me was like, man, he slayed all sucker MCs with that one, man. I was just like, all right, this dude put in the work, did something definitive. He wasn't apologetic. You know, he's weaving these pieces back and forth. And it's just a strong, you know, he's like a methodical voice, man, but he's I think of our generation, of our mindset. And he's kind of like just took this leap out there. And I look forward to just seeing that type of long, deep engagement with race in a real serious way, man. I mean, in some ways, I place my own work as like, man, that guy's serious. Me, I just write about, you know, science fiction, you know, films.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you start writing about reparations, man, you know, I mean, you got to do some homework because you know, cats are going to be coming. They're going to be gunning for you on that one. So you really have to cross some T's and dot your I's, and you can't be necessarily as creatively provocative. I think I'm able to do, certainly with discussions around science fiction, film and race, and comic books, and Tarantino, even hip hop to a lesser extent. And I think even in some ways when we talk about film studies, that type of work you do as well. But I still appreciate this type of groundedness.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, too. I just gave a talk, a colleague, friend, very kind to me. She writes for the Chronicle of Higher Education,
okay.
Claire Potter, under a tenured radical.
Yes, I read her.
So she's going to be on either shortly before or shortly thereafter our conversation. And she and I were talking about this sort of idea of public pedagogy and thinking about your own craft and life. And my career path is very, very, very unorthodox. Thinking about, okay, written some stuff, done some other things, trying to do this public pedagogy thing, wanting to be on radio more, wanting to be on TV more. And my whole thing, I was trying to explain to my mother, because my mother being a child of the 40s, born in the 40s in the South, always worried about her son getting in trouble. And I tried to explain to her, I'm like, I'm not afraid of these people.
Right.
And she's like, these people could say something or hurt you or do that. I was like, I made it this far. We black and breathing in America. And I'm not going to surrender truth-telling to cowardice.
That's right.
And I'm not hard to find. And when you deal with these people, you see, yeah, there's some serious players. But I was telling Claire Potter and her class, I was like, hey, you know what? The fact of the matter is, you should show your work.
That's
and
right.
You should be able to make your claims. And that's why I like Coates, and that's what I try to do in my own writing, is to be direct.
Yes.
And Ishmael Reed, like maybe it's the way I was raised by the men in my life and the women in my life too. But my father's, you know, old school sort of guy. He was a World War II vet.
Wow.
He was a MP. He fought in the war overseas, but he was also an MP, and he guarded Nazis when they came back here.
Wow.
And his thing was always, and he's a brother, he's black, but he could pass for white. And they let him pass for white in the army, and because all his friends, he would joke, he'd be like, yeah, we grew up together, and they were calling me nigger on Monday, but now we in the same unit, and I'm white. And he would put on his do-rag at night, and he'd have to wake up early so they wouldn't see that his hair was kinky.
Yeah, get his hair right.
Yeah, he had to get his hair right. And he would always say to me, you know, and the other men in my life, be like, you know, walk like a man.
Mm-hmm.
Be honest and be forthright.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the film stuff, because we could compliment each other all day, but your work is awesome too, because we can't forget that popular culture is one of the most important insights into a society's collective subconscious, especially film, because films are a society, and also the text, fighting with each other, arguing with each other, and talking to each other about itself.
That's right.
So we can learn so much about our society and race and ideology and class through studying pop culture. And it's funny, and I'm sure you've experienced this, so, you know, share some war stories. I'm really fascinated and moved, and sometimes shocked, even though intellectually I shouldn't be shocked as a student of Stewart Hall. We know about representation, we know about ideology. But when you have people arguing back at you saying, well, it's just a movie, or no, the Walking Dead TV show has nothing to do with race and masculinity. You're just seeing stuff that's not there. And on one hand, you want to say, okay, I don't want to talk rocket science to a wino, as the old expression goes, but I do got to do some teaching here. So, I mean, like, how have you handled those moments?
Well, you know, I think, you know, what's interesting to me, I mean, just to add a piece to it, in terms of these pop culture, in particular film, as, you know, insight into the kind of like ideological constructs, but one can even argue, if we want to get kind of psychoanalytic, is also a window into the collective subconscious, right? Of fears and desires, fantasies of wishes, right? And so, you know, it makes film and all these kind of like pop cultural texts very potent for what they can reveal, and often maybe what is hidden consciously but might be exposed in terms of its subconscious. The film as an expression of a collective subconscious. So in that sense, the critique is, well, sometimes a rose is a rose and a cigar is a cigar, and that's the conundrum, so to speak, with pop culture, with film. At least when you bring in the critical eye, and certainly I have to. When we talk about war stories, I concede that after some of my classes, a semester with me, I've had students say, "Man, I can't enjoy movies anymore." Right? I can't. You've kind of like wrecked my ability to, enjoy the cotton candy that I used to consume so wholeheartedly. But what I think for me is I try to balance it out in terms of, listen, some things you're going to do, some things you're going to see, some things you're going to say, and some of the things you are going to do, you're going to keep doing. Some of the things you're going to say, you're still going to say them. My concern is that you understand why you say what you say, why you do what you do, why you enjoy this film, right? And for me, it's, maybe it's the, a low bar, but by having a low bar of expectations, it keeps me from being consumed by a type of cynicalness when it comes to those war stories.
Yeah, my version of that is I tell students, especially in my hip hop classes, that I don't care if you like McDonald's. I just want you to know the difference between McDonald's and filet mignon.
There you go.
And I want you to know that you're eating poison.
There you go.
I drink poison. I drink soda. I know it's poison.
Yeah.
If you go see a Tyler Perry movie, know that this is poison.
That's right.
Know that you're dealing with racial transvestism and race minstrelsy.
That's right.
And understand what it says about masculinity and femininity. Understand it. That's all I care about. You can still watch it.
That's right. That's right. So
you can still. I enjoy a lot of ideologically backward stuff too, but I know what I'm seeing.
Right. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so it's some old fallback type of consciousness, right? I mean, false consciousness type of, it's kind of like some real some basic, Marxism at play here, just in terms of deal with like just some basic, consciousness issues. I'm going to leave it to the next person, who's more better versed and has more patience to actually maybe turn that awareness into some type of agency, right? I mean, that's at the end of the day, we want people not only to be aware, but to actually take responsibility and act for themselves and society in a constructive and thoughtful and committed way. I mean, but I'm also of the school that I need some successes to know that I should go ahead and wake up tomorrow morning and do it again, right? And so, base your success on, a wholesale type of transformative impact on, people who need to be transformed and be transformed right away. And you're not going to see that, I would argue, that type of microwave transformation of people in consciousness doesn't occur in such a quick timeline. But if you have but to see people begin to make steps toward a more holistic and full acknowledgement of themselves and the society they live, then I can go with that. Then I can go, we can go to the next step. So for me, the war story is about trying to maintain committed vision and trying to keep motivated to sit back down in that writer's chair when I just want to look at the ball game and call it a day.
There you go. I mean, and when you can get a student who says, wow, I never thought about it like that, or sends an email years later and be like, whoa,
yes,
that really helped me to think about something in a way I didn't think about, or say, you know what, I'm going to go and work in this field because you helped me to open my eyes to critical thinking in general. Because I just want people to be critical thinkers. That's all I care about.
There you go. And I've had all of those examples have happened. And, I think in the world that in the timeline that we work in now, in terms of trying to foster critical thinking, I think we live in a society now where, speaking to younger people, critical thinking, at one time you could have posed a logic game to them. I think now, since you have to use critical thinking off of popular culture and maybe a video game in and of itself becomes the kind of like the source material where we try to engage in kind of like, higher consciousness raising is through these kind of like, one could say, low cultural expressions.
It's a great example, sort of the low culture, high culture distinction. Adorno is sitting somewhere nodding his head as we have this conversation. That's right. And hopefully John Street and other folk as well are sitting there saying, hey, and of course the indispensable Jim Scott.
Yeah, man.
Got to always give him some love. Yeah. Scott's the man. But I'm thinking, we're sort of getting to our mutual love of sci-fi because that's brought us together. Yes. What was that moment, because you wrote Black Space, what was that, moment of awakening? Because sci-fi is not too welcoming, especially classic golden age sci-fi, to people of color.
Oh, man.
So what was your moment of awakening where you said, I want to do this. I can write this book. I can love this thing and be critical of it.
Grad school, PhD courses over at USC, and I was over in the film department. I'm geeking out on ability of people to take these films and talk about them in all these interesting ways, and the articles and everything. So there's this real kind of resonance with like film studies and just my whole geekness quotient, right? And I'd read different titles, these film journal articles, and it might start off with something like, how hypermasculinity of the Terminator series and what it means for American politics. Something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
And so I said, oh man, this is going to be a hot article, man. I'm going to deal with this. And I started to read it, man, and it was just so mind-numbing in terms of like what they were saying. And I was like, yeah, I understood it, but it just didn't.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff falls into that critical studies trap of being two experts using inside language and jargon to talk to each other in an impenetrable way.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is like high theory, man. And I was like, man, this is some bullshit. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, come on, man. We can do better than that. And so, in many ways, man, I had these other, sci-fi films in the back of my head, and certainly, I think really the true catalyst, that tension that is mentioned, but the book by, I believe it's Eric Green, when he writes about
Planet of the Apes. I was thinking about that.
Planet of the Apes. And I read that book, man, actually before I got to grad school, but I read that book and I was like, this book is the shit, man. This is what I'm talking about, man. This is interesting. And so I had that in the back of my head as I went to these film studies courses. And so when I finally, I got the PhD and everything, and I'm out, and, Publisher Parish is the name of the game. And so I didn't even try to, make my dissertation a book or anything. I just totally broke the Black Space. And I said, what would be, somebody was going to write a book about science fiction film and race, and particularly Blade Runner was a big fan. I'm a big fan of Blade Runner, right? And there have been some writings about the racial undercurrent of the replicants and et cetera. And they only touched on it, hit it for a quick second, and just when I was like feeling it's going to get good, it would branch off into its own postmodern, analysis, right?
Yeah, and Blade Runner, like I said, we are Voltron here. Maybe it's a moment with the Force. We're sharing a mind meld from Star Trek as well. Because I was thinking of apes and also Blade Runner, but continue if you would, because I don't want to lose the thought, but continue.
Yeah, man. So I was like, man, yeah, Blade Runner is like, man, it's got a lot of things going on with this race piece, man, but nobody's. And so for me, I was like, something, I'm going to write the book that I would want to read. Basically, that's how Black Space came up, man. I was like, I'm going to write some shit that I would want to pick up and be like, oh, snap. I can't believe this dude is talking about what I want somebody to talk about. That's how Black Space really emerged, man. It emerged from, a dearth of material, as they say, a gap in the literature and all that type of academic, scholarly type of position. But also just it emerged from my own kind of like geek quotient, man, of like wanting to deal with this and wanting to have a dialogue about it and having really no academic or scholarly type of sounding board. And then just as a African-American male, Black man growing up, there's another layer of kind of alienation, might be too strong a word, but Black dude in the science fiction, at least with the cats that I was hanging with, man, that's not a conversation where we could really just start, I could just start firing up my top 10 list of favorite Twilight Zone episodes with, you know what I'm saying?
And we really did live in this liminal space in a lot of ways because you're with a lot of your friends. I was lucky I had, Black and brown friends, other brothers who were into sci-fi. Okay. But most of the folks who were really into it were white. Yeah. And then I have my other friends because I love hip hop and I love comic books and dating a child of the hip hop generation, loving Star Wars, loving all these other movies. But then you feel like you're in this weird liminal space because, okay, do I mention this with these folk? Will they get it? And you're traveling between communities.
Yes.
You're like, oh, that's something white people like. But like, no. And it wasn't until years later, and I'm sure you thought about this too, you sit down and you're reading, Beyond Souls of Black Folk. When you're reading, Du Bois and his magisterial volume of work, my God, the man wrote so much. The brother was writing sci-fi too.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute. We're part of this intellectual tradition too. We can participate in this genre, and it'd be fun to hear some of your stories too. I remember going, to comic book conventions, going to Star Trek conventions, sci-fi conventions, and being the only black person, or one or two or three. Then we see each other, and it's either we're all going to be together, or it's going to be somebody's like, I want to be the only one.
Hey man, listen.
What are you doing in here?
Listen, man. Since you want, we tapped into war stories and reminiscences and all that type of thing, man. They say, they used to reminisce over you, right? I'm gonna tell you, man. Listen, just in terms of the type of like racialized bubble that I lived in and had to deal with, and maybe not dealt with, I didn't deal with in the most progressive and astute way. But there was a time, like as a kid. Here's the narrative, man. Here we go. As a kid growing up, I would go and read comic books. Tell my mom to get comic books. I say as much in Black Space. The intro. I'm sick. She gets my comic books for me. I stay home and read comic books. Or I would sneak over, or after school I would go over to like little 7-Eleven or whatever, and used to have the comic books in that
in the spinner rack. Yeah.
My money was short, so I would stand up there and read as much as I could until the man said I had to leave. But then there came a time where those spinner racks were no longer there. The comic book industry had shifted into the comic book store became the outlet for comics. And so I remember I was in Hawthorne. That's why I remember riding my bike and seeing a comic book store and saying to myself, and I was with my boy, I wanted to go into this comic book place, and it happened also again when I went to high school, but the crew that I was with, but I felt like, man, I can't go into that place because you know something, that's a white space.
There you go.
That space is not for me. If I go in there, it's going to be strange. So
you're not going to feel welcome. It's an assumption.
Yeah, it was all assumption. It was all a projection. All of my insecurities and anxieties and complexes that I had with my self, and particularly during adolescence, being vulnerable. So it's compounded in adolescence, right? I had actually projected onto the entranceway of a door that said comic book store.
That's real.
So, it's like I'm like Dracula at the door. I have to be invited to pass through the entranceway. So, and I lived like that for a long time, man. You see what I'm saying? So that racialized thing, man, had really. So I didn't even get a chance to have that experience of going into the comic book place or the convention or the whatever the setting would be, and seeing the other lone black person at the other end of the aisle, right? I didn't get that far to it.
And that shows I'm still smiling. That's beautiful. Because it's a shared experience, because you're thinking, I don't belong in here. Mm-hmm. I know they're not Klansmen.
Yeah.
But maybe they are. Will they beat me up? Will they call the cops?
Yeah, man.
Will people make fun of me?
Yeah.
And then as you mature and you're older now, and of course, geek culture still has issues. And I don't know if you read about it on the website. I'm sure maybe some of the listeners of the podcast heard my story because they were really cool. I went to Worldcon.
Okay.
With the help of the friends of the website. They threw some money in so I could go. And I was also there. I was invited to give a talk. And here's where our own egos and our own insecurities mess us up. Mm-hmm. So even today, think about the whiteness in the white space that is sci-fi and geek culture. Mm-hmm. So Worldcon, some people there are like, do you want to give a talk? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think I've done enough. Uh-huh. This and that. Little did I know that's really an honor.
Right.
For them to even have asked. And I shot myself in the foot, and one of my dear friends here, she's like, you need to go. And I was like, well, what if I go? Because they have these things, I'm going to mess it up, kerfutches or something, some beer salon thing they call it.
Okay, yeah.
And I was like, well, they put you in a room, and what if nobody shows up? And she's like, well, if nobody shows up, you won't be embarrassed.
Okay.
And I wasn't thinking, but we talk ourselves out of so many things.
Right.
As human beings, but also as people of color in these spaces and in this business.
That's right.
Instead of just saying, I'm going to go for it. And that's one of the day-to-day types of exhaustion and stress caused by living in a white supremacist society, is that you just talk yourself out of so many things. But back to the the sci-fi thing. I lost my train of thought for a moment. Yeah, so if we had any sense, because I know at that age I had some game, but not enough,
Right.
I would have gone to these conventions and been the only brother.
Yeah.
And gotten all sorts of attention, but I'm stupid and didn't figure that out till my 20s.
Yeah, man. Well, see, you still ahead of the game than me, brother. It took me. I'm a late bloomer. You know what I'm saying? So man, I'm in my 30s, man, thinking like, well, maybe I should try something different. You know, maybe I should go ahead and check that place out. You know, maybe I can go to that restaurant. Maybe that's okay. Maybe they're not gonna put something in my drink.
And they may still put something in your drink.
But hopefully I'm robust enough to bounce back. You know what I'm saying? So that was a real, issue in terms of how that world, which had, it was already going to have its own issues, but I was compounding it with my own struggles, which speaks to a larger struggle, just in terms of being black in America, right? Being black in the world, really. In terms of what spaces are you going to try to claim? On some level, maybe you could say it's part of this genetic memory, right? There's some places that as a black person, you go pre-1900, like, man, don't go over there.
1940s, a sundown town, or even
right?
Today, you were just not welcome. Trayvon walking down the street in a white gated community.
Yes, so that's real. You know what I'm saying? That's suspicious. That suspicion of let me know my environment, because this might not be okay for me to relax around. Which goes back to even to the Malcolm X thing about, hey, I don't ever sit in a restaurant or place with my back to the door. I mean, all of these things become very real in a certain way, and so there's a way in which science fiction becomes, at a certain way, the last stand of whiteness.
That's right. It's a projection of golden age sci-fi, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure. Was really a white space for their fantasies, where the race problem, where the gender problem, whatever social problem they didn't want to deal with, was dealt with by reading us out of the narrative.
That's right.
And using robots and aliens and alternate dimensions as a way of, in the best sci-fi, talking about the color line, right, and talking about injustice. But in the worst sort of white male heterocentric white supremacist fantasy, well, they solved the race problem by getting rid of us.
Structured absence. Right.
Structured absence. So thinking about black space and black space, white space. So you mentioned Blade Runner, and I was thinking of Eric Green's book too, because for me it was like, okay, because we're probably roughly the same age. I remember, again, watching Star Wars and saying, where are the black people? Because in that option we say, okay, and I'm sure you know this, and maybe some of the listeners do, Elvis Mitchell, cool brother, yes, film critic. Yes. I don't know what the heck he was thinking doing that special for that Empire TV show during the Super Bowl. I don't know. Or this playoffs. I was like, dude, why are you slumming? But he needed a check, I guess. But he's a cool guy.
Light bills have to be paid, brother.
Bills got to be paid. So he had to do what he had to do. But he has a cool essay in this collection on Star Wars where he talks about being in Harlem or Brooklyn watching Empire Strikes Back when Billy D. Williams shows up. And in the same essay, he talks about, okay, what do black people and brown people do? Like Bell Hooks says, we read ourselves into the text. So watching Star Wars and saying, Vader's a brother. He's voiced by a black man. And he's beating the hell out of these white rebels who are just troublemakers, and he's asserting his black masculinity on their behind, right? So I remember the Star Wars thing saying, okay, there's got to be something here. Where are we? You can have these fantastical things, but no black people. And selfless, shameless self-promotion. Folks know this. I always mention this. So when I was quoted in the Star Wars history special, I had a big smile on my face. I was like, the boy done come full circle. I knew we were going to get something on this. So that was awesome. Love to the History Channel. Thinking, all right, that was a moment. And I remember, and I don't know if you had experiences. I'm sure you probably did, and listeners who love sci-fi who are of color probably did too. And some white brothers and sisters too.
Okay.
Planet of the Apes. I remember watching that. I was like 7 or 8 the first time I saw it. So I knew it was about race in some way, but I didn't have the vocabulary.
Right.
And I remember talking to it with some friends, black and white, and also teachers. They're like, oh, you're crazy. It's not about that. And I'm like, well, it's got like this white guy and the apes, but they're not really like black people, but they are, and the different colors and the fire hoses and the way they're putting them in the museums. Because my parents let me read whatever. So I had on one hand, I had the great, I think Toni Morrison edited the Black Book.
Wow.
They had pictures of lynchings and had postcards, all sorts of stuff about, our people and our triumphs too. And I'm like, I know this the images look similar. And they'd be like, you're crazy. That's not there. And when you hear that from a teacher, that can either break you or provoke you. I'm hard-headed. So I'm like, no, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you it's there. So I remember Green's book was like mind-blowing when I saw it in the library.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, damn, We're not crazy, man. We're not crazy.
Yeah, man.
And then Star Trek, of course, and I'm very curious about your take on Trek, original or Next Generation, any of its iterations. I mean, because on one hand, it's like Trek gets a lot of love because of Uhura, first iteration kiss.
Yeah.
And imagine having Brother Dr. King call you up or show up and say, please stay on the show.
Right.
You can't discount that. But a lot of the revisionist readings of Trek that I'm very sympathetic to say that Trek is really problematic in terms of sort of white American imperialism and the way that black folks were used and depicted in the show. So, for example, think about, you mentioned Dracula, right? So, as you know, the actor who played Blackula is in the episode is the inventor of the M9 computer, M5 computer.
Yeah.
And the way they shoot him is very monstrous. Like, they emasculate him by only showing him, like, crouching down. They emphasize his size and height. And they make him this looming figure over Kirk. And then when you start thinking about, again, you've written and thought about this too, about how in Trek, how black men are depicted as either paranoid, schizophrenic, threats to Captain Kirk when they were going to have him lose his commander in the court-martial, insane. Yes. And you see this pattern, never mind Worf, who's a projection of sort of the anti-white man who's idealized whiteness and wants to become one. Never mind Geordi, a black man with blue eyes who loves white women. So, I mean, even something like Trek is really ideologically mixed. Am I being too hard on Trek, or do you think there's some real problems?
Well, you know, I think that there's another title I probably should have given some attribution to. I think it's Daniel Bernardi's Star Trek Racing Toward a White Future or something.
Yep, great book.
Yeah, so that's another one that stood out for me. I'm an old school cat a lot of the time, so I'm into the old school Trek with its
and I love Trek too, with the Orions,
with its psychedelic, funny little outfits and everything. But yeah, Uhura was, that's the one, right? I mean, I say so. She should have had her own show, right? So.
Now, have you ever seen, not to reduce the sister to the physical, but let's be real, two men thinking about being geeks and nerds loving Uhura.
Yeah.
It was before the internet, and when I finally saw her pictures when she was a burlesque dancer.
Right, she's a burlesque
Damn.
dancer. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the sister was on there with a cold mini skirt. You know what I'm saying? That was a cold sci-fi piece. You know what I'm saying? You catch your cat in his pre-pubescent tip, man, and you see his sister like that. Flashing the hookup, man, you like, oh man, I love to be the captain, and I know, who I'll be asking the next communication. You know what I'm saying? Where it came from, and let's talk about it. Okay, so now I got that out the way. The problematic aspects of the show, for me, everything that you just said is true. I would say, in terms of how problematic is. How it's constructed race, it isn't necessarily the epitome of this multicultural construct that people.
Yeah, and it's also a homogenizing whiteness, because as much as they talk about the Federation and trade and culture and the Prime Directive, they judge the narrative frame judges other cultures and aliens as deficient relative to the White Federation.
We don't need to put that on Trek. We can just put that on
That's right.
Television. 9 out of 10 shows, during that same time period, right? Let's say, mid 60s, late 70s, early 70s, just are having problems shooting black people. They're having problems in terms of the aesthetic of how they are constructing black folk, right? I mean, you can take I guess the pinnacle of I guess progressive shows at the time, I Spy. That show is problematic in terms of, I think the character. I think it's Alexander Smith. I might have got that wrong, but his character never really had a love interest compared to the main white one. So there is this type of emasculation that is like part and parcel of how black folk are going to be presented, and that shows up in Star Trek. It shows up in almost any television show of that time. I'm not trying to let Star Trek off the hook.
No, absolutely.
But I want to contextualize Star Trek in terms of being, symptomatic as well of these fundamental issues, which I think Star Trek was getting too much of a pass in some ways, because it did have this degree of tokenism, which I think it should be, in my mind, I can dap that up. I can dap up the fact that of all the shows that thought about putting some black people in, it is something progressive to be said about having black people in Star Trek. Now we get past that, kind of like pat on the back. Now let's deal with how they're constructed.
Yeah, and that's why I give so much love to Avery Brooks's character. And again, he fits the archetype too. Black man, single father with serious mental health issues.
Right.
Who thinks he's a child of the prophets, and you find out stuff about his family. And it was one of the greatest episodes of genre TV I've ever seen. The number one, the DS9 conclusion. But when he's going back and forth, when he had the episode when he was in Harlem, or actually Harlem in the early 50s. That won a ton of awards, and they deserve to win a ton of awards. So Avery Brooks is, got the asterisk because he's such a powerful depiction of black masculinity in the best sense of it.
Right.
But as you said, these texts are a product of their time, and we have to do that subtle work to say, yeah, it's X. Yeah, the text has issues, but it's also Y too.
Yes.
And I have nothing but love for Gene Roddenberry.
Yes.
Period.
And so I think, for me, and I think that's which goes back to some, original kind of like point you were raising earlier about, war stories and, dealing with this pop culture as such. I think that's makes my work unique, and at least unique in terms of maybe an emergent trend, because I feel that most of the scholarship around race had really been bogged down by this, the positive versus negative representation of blackness, and was bogged down in a way in which you had to prescribe an answer to this particular image that was put forth. And I've tried to give credit where credit is due, but I've also tried to really wrestle with those problematic aspects as well that you have to contend with. Hopefully, type of perspective will continue to, I think, add a certain depth to our discussion about, not only our discussion about these things, but when people go back to the drawing board, they try to draw up these characters. You can have black folk and black shows that are really interesting because they're really striving to push past kind of like these conventional notions of blackness. I used to talk about the show The Wire, and I used to say, and I still stand by this, I think, it was one of my favorite shows, and is also one of the shows I hated the most. I had this deep ambivalence about the show because I thought some of the acting was very, very well done. I thought the character of Omar was very interesting, but then I had some real problems with kind of like it seems to deal with black pathology as the kind of the normative order of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then there was just so much of a clamor for them in terms of how people just, for some reason, people seem to like the things that are most problematic about black folk.
Maybe I'm just a contrarian, or maybe I came to The Wire late. And on one hand, I'm happy that Bill Wilson, Dr. Wilson, all he's accomplished is teaching a course at Harvard, I think. I think he's still at Harvard, yeah, about using The Wire. So that's cool. It's being treated as a serious text.
Right.
But being the contrarian I am, whenever a bunch of folks say something is great, I'm going to ask some hard questions.
Yeah, man, I'm with you.
When students and other people started coming up to, have you watched The Wire? The Wire, you should teach The Wire in class. Wire this, Wire that. I start, and it's not the fault of the text. No text is perfect.
That's right.
But part of me is like a little concerned that it's sort of like this liberal cultural tourism.
Yes.
And they can watch The Wire and say they know poor black people.
Yes. Wasn't that in my mind, the problem with Precious? For me, that film...
Well, that's pathology porn.
Yeah, this is what we totally agree on this. You call it pathology porn. I call it one of the greatest horror movies. Seriously, it's a horror movie. I said every October 31st, I start my evening out with with Dracula. I follow it up with the werewolf from London. And then I say when the witching hour comes, I press play and we put in Precious.
Oh,
that's
man.
Real talk, man.
And you want to think about another movie that fits, and it's an obvious joke, and the folks listening know we're having some fun right now. And I haven't been drinking either. I don't know if you've been drinking.
Man, I'm straight up and down right now, man.
Is The Blind Side.
Oh, man,
he's a humanized monster too. A white woman takes this beast and humanizes him and civilizes him and takes him from his tribe of feral black people who are monsters.
Feral, that's the right word.
Yeah, they're feral monsters. They're trolls. I don't know what they are. And she civilizes. This is her personal Frankenstein. And the point is, he doesn't go crazy and kill the little white child.
That's right.
He's picking flowers.
Housebroken.
He's a housebroken monster.
Yeah, man. Yeah, monstrous blackness, brother.
Man alive. How many other brothers and sisters are out there thinking and talking about this stuff too? Because we need to have a conference, or we need to get a journal together, or an edited volume, because we can't be alone. Because that's the other thing too, about sort of folks who write about race and the Colorline, and these film studies and who are intersectional, interdisciplinary. It's like, there's some other folk. I can name 5 or 6 other people.
Oh, yeah.
Never mind giving love to the late Richard Eichen, who's a genius,
right.
who passed away last year, 2 years ago. I mean, who are the other folks that you were following and reading?
Man, you know, I tell you, my lament is that much like sometimes I feel like as if I'm one of those mad scientists that I've ran across in all these films that it's too much time in the lab, man. I need to come out and socialize with some people. I woodshed, man. I just woodshed. I just been writing and reading and writing. My wife, you know, she's like, "Oh, you're in the woodshed again. You shedding?" I'm like, "I'm shed, babe."
Cutting that wood.
There's other cats, man. One of the cats that I'm gonna give a shout out to is in the game. His name is John Jennings.
Yep, John Jennings is awesome.
Yeah.
Yep.
So his whole tribe of people that he really keeps me abreast of what's going around and what's going down, so to speak, man. So Nnedi Okorafor, I always butcher people's names. I think doing some interesting things around science fiction and more in the realm of fantasy, having a position around race that is not didactic, right, but artistic. Mm-hmm. So
you know whose work is also good is David Leonard, white brother.
David Leonard.
His work is on pop culture is very good.
What did he write, man? That sounds real familiar, man.
He has a new edited volume out. And you know, I've talked to him over the years. He's going to be on the podcast too. And the title escapes me. I think it's his 2nd or 3rd book. And he has some really cool stuff in there about comic books and on the Punisher.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe that's where I read that from, man.
So thinking about, you know, we're talking about film and teaching film. And this is so timely that you mentioned the movie. How have you taught Blade Runner in class? Have you had to struggle with it? Because when I've shown one of my favorite films, and I'll admit when I first saw it at 9 or 10, I didn't get it. But, you know, when I've taught that movie, especially to folks who are new to science fiction, dead eyes, dead reception, struggling to stay awake. And no matter how exciting, no matter the reading materials I give them, no matter how exciting I try to make it in terms of thinking about agency and the replicants, are they runaway slaves, which they are, giving them, you know, Frederick Douglass to read, helping them to think about, you know, Harrison Ford as, you know, sort of symbolic of threatened and battled whiteness and white masculinity, talking about the surveillance society, all the good stuff going on there, and helping them to see, you know, the other joke about that movie is, I tell them, watch the opening film because it rewards deep viewing. So watch the opening scene. And that's a challenge, too, to teach casual film folk. I don't know how you deal with it. The difference between superficial viewing and deep viewing. Like, Children of Men is a movie that rewards deep viewing. And I'm like, look at the background.
Yes.
Look at the foreground. I'm like, watch Blade Runner and look at all the ads for companies and products that no longer exist.
Right.
That's like one of the fun games in Blade Runner. How has that gone over in your classes? Because for me, it's just not working.
Okay, so for the let me say for the record, man, you know, I have to, you know, give you a standing ovation for trying to, you know, do what you're doing.
Thank you, because I'm tired after I show Blade Runner.
Because, see, I'm like, man, I'm not going to try that. That to me is like, that's a master's class. And I'm not going to come in there with kind of like the master class syllabus and lecture and insights. And, you know, people are not at that level, nor are they even trying to strive to be at that level, right? So for me, when I talk about racial readings of films, and I start them off with, it was a Dino De Laurentiis remake of King Kong from the 70s. Yeah, from the 70s. I think it's 76. And then I give them some materials by Sneed and his you know, kind of psychoanalytic, you know, black monstrous sexuality type of articles, and then we also deal with a little bit of Stuart Hall in terms of reading, deconstructing film. And so I start with some real basics, man. You know, all of a sudden then they feel pretty empowered when they can say, oh, wow, the way they kept pushing that thing into the giant wall, that's very phallocentric.
That's right.
Right? So then they can tell me all the things that they found. I start at, you know, for me, it's rudimentary. I don't know if I think we're the same generation, but you remember Romper Room? I mean, that was,
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm a Romper Room type of cat, man. So that's where I start. For me, Blade Runner is like, man, I can't even imagine. You know, I would love to do what you're doing. You know, I would love to be in a class with you as either the co-teacher or just laying a cut.
You'd be the hard one raising the question every teacher hates. Be like, I like you sometimes, but other times you annoy me.
Right. Yeah, you know, I'm going to be that cat. You know what I'm saying? So,
that's who I was.
You know, so I got love for that, man. So all I can say is, well, keep at it if you can.
I mean, it was exhausting.
Yeah, man, yeah.
Because, the glazed over eyes, and I try to, and I'm sure you tell students this too, be like, all right, we're studying film. It's not a time to turn your brain off. It's a time to turn your brain on. So that's number one challenge. And then as the teacher practitioner, it's like, okay, we do a lot of things, and are, scholars too, that we take for granted, but you had to learn those skills.
Right.
And I tell them, the first time I saw this, I didn't see these things.
Right.
It took repeated viewings. It took a lot of reading. It took a lot of meditation. So you get to a point where you're not struggling to understand the narrative. You're looking for symbolism. You're looking for patterns. And I try to tell the students, and as I said, I'm sure you do it and others do it too. I'll be like, if I see one thing that's interesting, if I see a pattern, I have data.
You're a teacher. I mean, you're an instructor. You are, you're firing on all pistons, man. But, for me, and this is why I think we are, I'm going to take liberties here, man. You can and come in and adjust it as you see fit with this observation and commentary. I think in some ways we are really, I'm not going to say victims of, but certainly we are constructed in terms of a black aesthetic of call and response. See,
yep.
When I'm dealing, man, when it's for real and we vibing and we dropping this information, man, is playing at a high level, in between level, multiple levels, man. We want that feedback. We want that, somebody to bear witness on it. Give as you get as you give, right? And the predominantly white construct of the college classroom, man, it is not set up for call and response. It's not set up for that black aesthetic. And so, I think our counterpart could just push through that whole lecture and consider it a success. Whether it's glassy-eyed or, blinky-eyed or, a question from, one or two, participatory students. They're like, job done. As me, as part of being part of the black aesthetic, man, one that call and response, man, I'm in class, man, and I know I'm flowing, and I know I'm doing what's supposed to be done. I know that if I had me or someone similar to my sensibility, they're with me. They're going to let me know. Yeah, okay, well, they're going to engage me at that level, man. And so I feel in some ways I've had to kind of like dial down, kind of like, okay, remember, this is this. Where I think if maybe I was at, if I was at another setting, I would still deal with that kind of intellectual morose, but there's a certain type of way in which that call and response makes itself known.
I didn't even think about it in those terms because, that's a brilliant observation. And again, think about the call and response model, the black cultural aesthetic, because the way I frame the way I was taught, and I'm common sense, sort of try to be a common sense sort of person. First in my family go to college, product of the working class, spent a lot of money to go to school, is be like, I don't want to teach a course that I wouldn't want to be a student in.
Yeah.
That's my rule. Yeah. And sometimes it's going to be a stinker. Sometimes some things are more interesting than others, but I don't just phone it in.
Yeah.
And I think about my work. And that's why maybe you're right. It's sort of like it's troubling you. Like, I'm giving you something here that's good.
Yeah.
I'm killing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're not getting it, or your mind is, give me something.
Exactly. No, exactly, man. I'm telling you, I've wrestled with this, brother. I've wrestled with this. So that's why I'm speaking on it in an insightful way. I said, man, what is, this thing? And I've been in situations and settings, man, where it can just, that organic, synergy that takes place. Black classes, I've also had kind of mixed classes as well. But usually I got some of my people in there. And from their energy, if you want to get metaphysical on it, gets organic, man, and you get into it's like a jazz thing, man, and you doing your thing, they're coming back, well, what about this? And people just vibing off of it, man, and you're like, okay, this is how it's supposed to go. But then you have, for the majority's sake, man, it's just like, come on now, you're out there. It's like the proverbial guy tapping his microphone. Is this thing on? Right?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And that's why I love the Socratic approach. Sometimes dead white men can teach us a hell of a lot.
Right.
Talking, dialoguing. The classics are the classics across the color line. But two quick questions and a request, because we hinted at it before we started chatting, a little quick pre-interview. We're going to have to do something very quickly for our own entertainment or that of others.
Okay.
How do you, as a scholar of sci-fi, and of course, fingers crossed, you're going to be back on the podcast again because we're going to have another sit down.
Oh, I love
a lot
man.
to talk about. As a fan of sci-fi, as a scholar of science fiction and film, how do you deal with knowing the personal histories and backstories of a lot of these authors and filmmakers. So, for example, I'll give you one that I felt like a damn fool about, and I wrote about it on ChaunceyDeVega.com. I literally felt like I felt like a fool. So Heinlein's
Yes, that's the one.
Stranger in a Far, what is that book? Stranger in a Strange Land. So I read the book, and for a week, I'm moved by this book. I'm like, I see why this is a classic, because I have a whole list of classics, films I haven't watched, books I haven't read. And I was like, let me read Heinlein. And I'm walking around, grok this, grok that, grok, I'm grokking the sandwich. I got a pretty woman, I'm gonna grok her later. I got this Sapporo beer, I'm gonna be grokking this beer. Then I discover the man's a white supremacist. And I'm like, I'm the biggest effing fool, and I generally don't swear, but I'm gonna abbreviate that one. I felt like an idiot.
Yeah.
A true fool.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile that? Does the art stand by itself, or do we say some folk are just a no-go? I mean, how do you figure that out? Because a lot of Golden Age sci-fi is profoundly racist.
Well, man, to me, this is the conundrum of blackness, right? How do you spend that money that's got that picture of that person who had your ancestors enslaved? You know what I'm saying?
That's deep. There you go.
You know what I'm saying? But you got to spend this money to get what you need. You hear what I'm saying? I mean, for me, that's the conundrum of blackness, man. That's Du Bois, double consciousness. You see what I'm saying? That is as Nas says, the gift and the curse. You know what I'm saying? Of being black. That we have to deal with levels of existential questioning and angst that other people have no sense.
That's right.
Right?
And that causes racial battle fatigue. Psychologists have a term for it.
Right.
It's called racial battle fatigue.
That's right. I mean, that's real. That's why brothers, man, need to find their funny bone and make sure that thing is working. That's right. Because I'm telling you, man, if you don't, we got to show the lifespan. So they say human laughter is supposed to be medicine, brother. So we need a healthy dose of it. You know what I'm saying? So and Chester Himes was I'm riffing on it. Chester Himes was kind of like the epitome of that, because he dealt with absurdity, right? The absurdist ethos of what it means to be black. At a certain level, to be black is to deal with the absurd, right? And then if you want to get Fanonian about it, position other than to transcend this absurd drama that's been staged around them. So you have people who try to transcend the absurdity, and then others who revel in it and become absurd in their own absurdity, right? So this is the conundrum of blackness, man. So I can riff on it. I necessarily can't come with a definitive answer on it, but I do know this: you got to riff off of it. You know what I mean? And so your response to me is like really like insightful, to be able to like flip it and turn it around and then interrogate it. It's a constant, to me, engagement with that. At one level, we can do that because we have to be critical of, say, D.W. Griffin's, Birth of a Nation, right, which is considered like a marvel, right?
That's right.
But content-wise and what it's about and what it's advocating is absolutely perverse to the black sensibility. But
in a human sensibility.
Yeah, thank you. But nevertheless, it is also the grammar for all film. So to deal with film is to deal with D.W. Griffin at a very simple, at a very basic level, right? So, should we like not shoot close-ups now because we know it comes from one of the preeminent racist directors in the world? You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
So I'm trying to say that this position of blackness requires us to create new ways of trying to deal with some questions that seem not to have real answers. You know what I mean?
The nail on the head. That's the conundrum. And think about, we use language like white privilege and sort of the psychological wages of whiteness.
Yes.
But when you cut to the wick, when you cut down to the bone, privilege is all the stuff you don't have to worry about. And think about how you'd be either mentally freed if you don't have to think about these things, or alternatively, and this is why I think black sci-fi and speculative fiction by Octavia Butler and others, and our great tradition of black writers, are not our oppression, but our ability to see a broad humanity and our ability to deal with grief, to deal with pain, to deal with these contradictions. I take that as a gift.
That's
I remember
right.
I told folks this, I tell students this, I said on the podcast, maybe when we first started 2 years ago, maybe on the website. I remember walking down the street with a dear friend of mine at the time. His name was Ota. He's since passed. And I believe he's since passed. Yeah, unfortunately. Running brother from the elementary school, middle school.
Okay.
He was sort of the knucklehead, but cool people. Yeah. And I'm the working class striver, always trying to do good. We're walking down the street in Hamden, Connecticut, where I'm from. And I don't know how we started talking about racism or black people, white people. Middle school wisdom. I think he asked me, or I asked him, would you ever want to be white? And he says, no, life would be too easy.
See, that's what I'm saying, man. That's a clip.
Maybe we're just gluttons for punishment, but I think there's a lot of strength that comes from having to deal with these conundrums.
That's how you come in contact with your true humanity and essence, man. Because you know something, I say this, I believe this, man. Everybody's great. Everybody's a beautiful person. Everybody is somebody to be admired and appreciated when things are going good. You know what I'm saying? But man, when the struggle kicks in and it gets a little tough, that's when you know who you are and who you're looking at across from you. That's when you know. Right? That's when you know who's got character, who's stand up, and that's when you know your limits. And you only know your limits until you test it. Because everybody talks a good game, man. I'm telling you that right now. I talk a strong game. But you know what? I've been tested.
That's right.
And so I know, that's, what do they say? Know thyself,
To thy own self be true.
See? And you can't get to that, man, just sitting up in the pad, just thinking and looking in the mirror, thinking that you're a bad man. At some point, you got to go outside.
I mean, everybody's really tough, and the old expression goes, everybody's tough until they get hit, they get punched in the nose, as the old expression goes, and then you know.
Then you know.
You may not be as bad as you think you are. And I mean, this is like I said, we got to sit down and build some more. Another wonderful film illusion. And listeners, this is what happens when you get two film black ghetto nerd geeks together.
That's right.
Who also teach and write. We'll talk forever.
That's right.
Infinitum, because there's so much to talk
That's
about.
Right.
Thinking about one of my favorite scenes in recent film history. And when we talk about film in recent, we mean like 50 years.
Okay.
Or 25 years. Unforgiven. I don't care what people say about Eastwood.
Yeah.
Unforgiven is a masterwork. And that scene where William Money, who's his character, interestingly enough, last name Money, and then the sheriff's character,
Little Bill.
where the sheriff, what's his name? Little Bill. And you remember the scene where Little Bill is talking to the reporter that he just beat up, that British reporter, and he's talking about bad men.
Yeah, the Duke of Death.
And how there are so few really bad men like William Money, the Brit, and myself around. And in that one instance, why I love that movie, he created a whole universe.
That's right. That's right.
And you think about in every area of life where there are bad men, you could be the baddest doctor, you could be the baddest writer, poet, with a real specialist. They tend to know each other.
That's true.
And there's that small world of overlaps. And that's why that movie just rings, because it'd be like, those bad men either know each other directly or by reputation.
Right.
Because they got to be ready for each other.
Yeah. No, man. That's, hey, man, I've been looking at that movie. It's funny. I mean, we're vibing on the same tip, man. This movie's been on cable TV for like the last 2 weeks, man. It seems like they show it every 6 hours, man. So it's been popping up. And I just been dealing with it, man. I've been dealing with that flick, the symbolism of it,
Morgan Freeman's death.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about, French, because we started off talking about Django, and there's another powerful scene in Django. My mother saw it, and she thought it was the greatest thing ever. She's like, Chauncey, this is the greatest thing ever. That's Jamie Foxx killing him white people. I was like, man, it's a hell of a fantasy. But I mean, you have the entertainment part, but the most powerful part of that movie, one of them for me, we're talking about the fantastical elements and storytelling, all that great stuff, is the friendship between Django and Dr. King Schultz.
Yes. Right.
In the scene to Croce's I've Got a Name, where you have he's teaching him how to kill and to shoot. Right. And you have that moment of brotherly respect. In that movie, I would suggest would not have worked. It would have been a white savior movie. In some ways it is, if Dr. King Schultz was condescending to Django. Right. And there's just so much going on about mutual manhood and respect in that one scene.
Right. No, I and just to read off of that and riff off of it, in my book, I talk about Schultz really symbolizing the erudite abolitionist. And that, so his use of language and posture becomes symbolic of the abolitionists and their notion of brotherhood and respect of men between men. So I think your analysis is right on point. There are these very much for me, very redeeming. I'll speak of it in the language that I do in the book. I think that's a form of radical racial politics. Have the film have those type of cornerstone points in it, and the absurdist sensibility that courses throughout the film as well.
Yeah, and I mean, and even thinking about, like, it's a deep viewing. We can do a whole episode talking about Django easily.
Oh, easily.
The deep viewing that is rewarded when Django and Schultz go to buy the clothes, and you see all the different signs about selling niggers.
Yes.
And then the haberdasher and all the slave auctions, all that. So this is a living world. And I love that idea. I mean, it's a little superficial, but it still works within a sort of absurdist, mythic fairy tale.
Right.
So as you said, he has the blue outfit on, the blue clothes. And that moment where he gets to choose his own saddle and his own clothes.
Yes. Right.
That moment of agency.
Right. And one of my somebody hit me to it, and I had to go back and like, oh, he does say that. When I think Django, when he comes back, he says, he knocks on the door and he says, "This is for D'Artagnan." So D'Artagnan was the cat who got torn apart by the dogs.
Yep.
So there is this type of like radicalness in terms of like this guy isn't. You think it's just him, but he's invoking this dude. He's invoking D'Artagnan. We can go. I mean, and there's, of course, for all those listening, there are some very problematic aspects of Django, and I do write about those and acknowledge them as well. So,
oh yeah, no text is perfect.
That's right, no text is perfect.
But as we wrap it up, hinting at a future episode, Adilifu, here's my question or request. We can edit this out if you say hell no. We were joking earlier about the voices that we use.
Okay.
And you said you have your NPR voice and your regular voice. I'll give you, and I've had this happen when I go on job interviews and I show up and they think I'm white because they've been talking to me on the phone. And they're like, oh, yeah. So you want to give us a little sample of your NPR code switching?
Okay. Well, I'll go for it, man. But I have to put an asterisk by it. My code switching is more like he sounds like a smart black man than an ignorant black man. So
I like that.
So I ain't gonna never be mistaken for a white man. I'm gonna tell you that right now.
Oh, that's funny.
So the only difference is that I think he might have gone to school somewhere. So in that sense, man, it might not even be worth the effort.
Well, in any event, we got to laugh out of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And laughter's our medicine, man. But I want to thank you for sitting down and thank you for sitting down and chatting, man. It was wonderful.
Oh man, yeah, beautiful thing, man. I love to chop it up with a real cat, man. Like I say many times, man, I don't get a chance to really chop it up for real, man. There's a lot of, I think going back to Unforgiven, man. There's a lot of cats out I can converse with, and as I say, conversate, interact, and engage, and we can operate from a level of mutual respect for our humanity and our understanding. But there's very few cats that I can chop it up with, man, and like let the full range of the game kind of like unfold as it should be from high theory, barbershop antics, man. So I really enjoy the ability to have that type of fluidity in our conversation, and most of all, I also enjoy actually listening to what other people have to say that are informed, that can teach me a few things more that I need to know. And I certainly did get that from you and this conversation. Some books I need to look up, go back, some things I need to reconsider. So maybe even some approaches to ponder for a moment, right? So I want to appreciate, show deep appreciation for that.
Oh, man, mutual respect, nothing but love. Like I said, next time we'll have our 7 Deadly Venoms Shaw Brothers conversation, and we'll pick what animal or fighting style we would adopt.
Nice.
In terms of our own work. So that'll be our next conversation. Where can folk find you online, and what work you have coming out in the near future they should look out for?
Oh, man, I'm a neo-Luddite, man, as well as you know, in terms of the backstory of how we're even having this conversation. So my digital presence is a very light, a light print, a very light footprint there. I have a Facebook page, but I rarely post.
I don't even use it. Where can folk find you at your university if they want to track you down?
I'm Googleable, if that's a word. I'm at LMU, Loyola Marymount University, in California. I'm associate professor in the African American Studies Department. I've written 3 books. My 3rd book will be out at the end of March. It's called Race on the QT. Blackness in the films. Blackness in the films of Quentin Tarantino. Currently, I'm writing a book on Prince. So
wow,
we'll see how that.
You and Teray are in company.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah. I read Teray and I said, well, okay, and I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at okay.
Absolutely, and as I said, we're going to sit down and do this again. And as I said, learn so much. Adilifu, cool people, man. It was wonderful.
Oh man, yeah, pleasure, man. I'll be reading you soon, man.
Good sharing there. Again, much love to Adilifu Nama. Black Space is a great book if you haven't checked it out. His new book on Django is going to be a must-read. And his other book on popular culture, race, and graphic novels and comic books is also excellent. As I said, I so appreciate the good, kind, smart, interesting folks doing interesting things who have appeared on the podcast. I mean, I've shilled for this before. It is important. If you can, if you want to, if you are so empowered, go on to iTunes and see if you can give us a recommendation or a click, because we keep hovering in those 30s under the new and noteworthy. Right? New and noteworthy? New and notable? Whatever they call that new and noteworthy notable thing right there for the podcast. if you can give us some love there, that'll get us to the top 20. And then that will get us even more eyes. So you like folk like Adilifu Nama, the other great guests we've had on here. Do that little act of kindness and generosity if you would. But as I said, I almost had a little moment there, a little tearing up there thinking about that conversation with Brother Ota. And Ota, again, always trying to speak life to those who have passed on. I heard Brother Ota had passed. I hope it's not true. We grew up next door to each other, basically. He was on one end of the street, I was on the other. He had real talk about real people. His brother's name was Fish. That was his nickname. I don't know because he liked to eat fish or he worked at a fish market, but he was sort of like the cool older guy. And he was just cool people. I mean, he had his own demons too. And we had so many adventures. I mean, from throwing smoke bombs at construction workers. That was sort of dangerous. To throwing water balloons at passing cars from overhead bridges. To smoking behind the Salvation Army box. I'm laughing now, going down memory lane. Where's the time go? I remember that my brief experimentation with cigarette smoking, I had Lucky Strikes because that's what they were smoking. Ota, some of the other rabble I was rolling with, and I mean rabble in the best sense. And we'd smoke them Lucky Strikes, and I'd cough and get sick. And in the mind of a 9-year-old or 10-year-old, I thought that if I went to the Wawa convenience store and got some mints to eat, that somehow I wouldn't smell like smoke. And my mother would just joke about it. She's like, oh, somebody is smoking. Who's been around smoking? She'd just look at me. So, of course, I stopped. But here's one of Ota's greatest moments. Yeah, and if you have had friends like this, I'm sure you have. I mean, you think about the folks that you walk down to adulthood with, some of them who survived, others who got caught up in stuff and didn't make it. But Ota and I would hang out near the Salvation Army box. And on a dare, this is one of my fondest memories, Ota crawled inside the Salvation Army box and did a number 2. He produced a poop from his booty hole, or he made a bowel movement, however you want to frame it. And he wiped his behind with the clothes in the Salvation Army box. I know that's wrong, but if there is ever a movie in my life, that moment is definitely going to be in there along with some of the other fun mishaps and mayhem and cool things we enjoyed. But Ota, I remember that conversation, walking down to the convenience store to get a Snapple iced tea, because Snapple was the new thing. Remember when Snapple came out and all the debate about if it on the label was a KKK rally or something, or slavers or something? It's all BS. Lies circulated by folks who were against the manufacturers, I guess, of Snapple's position on abortion. And of course, in that long summer, we also had rumors about Church's Fried Chicken and Saltpeter and other things as well. So those urban legends still live on, I'm sure, in other forms. But we were going to get our 5th Snapple of the day because Snapple was so good at the convenience store where I later ended up working. And we had that profound conversation about what does it mean to be young and black, and would you ever want to be white? I remember that conversation. I just hope Ota, wherever he may be, is okay, and that Fish is okay too. But I also heard that Fish and also their mother met an untimely demise. So, riding my back, getting that little distance there for a moment. I had to go down that road. But I mean, that's the wonderful power of doing a conversation like this with Adilifu and others on a podcast. And that's why I like the format. You know, Werner Herzog's Bear, friend of the website, mentioned him many times. I'm going to have to sit down and have him come on the podcast. He's cool people. Had talked about sort of why he prefers podcasts in many ways to other formats, because it's radio. You can hear emotion in the voice. You can have intimate conversations. You can establish a rhythm. And that's all I try to do here, is just to be real, you know, to tell the truth as best I can and to have exciting conversations with interesting and smart people who have good stuff to say so we can all learn from them. So in terms of that moment of oversharing, oh yeah, and I mentioned it earlier. And how did I drop this one? My rant about technology and reading Ethiop got me all worked up. So Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, this is my animal news update, will no longer be oppressing and torturing and abusing our animal elephant friends. The elephant, along with our chimpanzee friends and other great apes. I know Gordon Gartrell, another friend. We know who he is. He gets mad at my confusion of gorillas and apes and chimpanzees. But to me, they're all the same. I know that's not true. And as I said, the dolphin. And there are other creatures too. Some of these crows are mighty smart. But finally, under the law, the dolphins and our elephant friends are getting protection in many countries as non-sentient people, or rather as sentient non-humans, or some version of that language. So basically acknowledging their deep intelligence. And now there's all this research apparently coming out saying, oh my God, the emotional lives of dogs and cats and other animals are much more complicated than we thought. Anyone who's ever owned a dog or a cat, or even my dearest bearded dragon friends that I've had, know that there's many types of intelligence in the world. I know my Lukey and Leia and Snoopy and JJ and Bandit and Bertrand and Bishop were extremely aware of their environment. They were thinking creatures. They were loving. They were smart. And they were mischievous. Luke and Leia could play a trick on somebody, and never mind watching their relationship with each other. So, of course, all this research saying our animal friends have complicated emotional and intellectual lives. But the circus, Ringling Brothers will no longer be abusing these poor elephants. And that makes me so happy. If I ever had kids, I would not allow them to go to the circus. I remember going to the circus once or twice as a kid. I hated it. I did not like zoos. Zoos make me very upset to see these proud and beautiful and wonderful animals in captivity developing neuroses and just depressed creatures. And I don't know if I ever had kids, how I would negotiate that one. Because we do need to have conservation and preservation and educate the public about the need to protect all the biodiversity and the wonderful species on this earth, because we keep messing this thing up. The writing is already on the world. Mother Gaia is already, on the tipping point of knocking us out of this place and resetting the clock, because Earth will continue without us. The ecosystem will continue without man. That's for sure. So, as I said, I had my OTA sharing sci-fi laughing moment with Adilifu. So the next episode, again, in keeping with the oversharing theme, one of the most popular post on ChaunceyDeVega.com. It's something I discovered about 2 years ago. Maybe 3. Time goes by so fast. And it was about race and bondage, BDSM, bondage, domination, submission, masochism. And it was where these black folks can go to be in a slave fantasy as chattel slaves. Now, every day, I kid you not, on the weekend it's especially true. At night, man, you get some freaky deaky stuff going on with these keyword searches. Black cuckolding slaves. I want to be a black slave on a white plantation. White man, black penis, watch wife. And I'm GGG. Game, giving, generous, however you want to take that Dan Savage acronym. I enjoy life. I'm sex positive. I have no guilt about a damn thing. God is not in my bedroom telling me to feel guilty about a damn thing. But even I have my limits. And that limit for me is the color line and my dignity and my self-respect. So I wrote, we had 2 posts where we had the images from a website that will remain nameless. You can go online and find them. And it was this black man being inspected on a platform as though he was a slave, and then he was going to be having sex with these 5 or 6 white men as a slave. And I said, hey, that ain't working for me. I'm sorry. I don't like race play. I don't like playing with race and gender in the bedroom. None of that stuff. That's just not Chauncey DeVega's way. So got a cool series of emails, an inquiry actually, out of the blue. Not out of the blue, it was in response to some of these posts saying, hey, would you be willing to be a guest on a panel via satellite, I guess, or maybe in person, discussing race play and sort of the moral and ethical dimensions of it. And I said, hey, you know what? I can fake it, but it won't be real. And if you fake it, the people know. I can certainly say something intelligent. I read enough about human sexuality, but I'm not an expert in the academic sense on the topic, so I politely declined. So lo and behold, we do the podcast. I say, you know what? I want to continue that conversation. I think there's something really cool and interesting here to talk about. Number one, human sexuality in a mature way, to talk about the color line, to talk about identity, and see where the dialogue goes. So I sent the email through the magical internet machine, and lo and behold, great conversation for the next episode of the podcast. Our next guest will be Dr. Rosalind DeShivo. She is founder and director of the Institute for Sexuality, Education, and Enlightenment, ISEE. She's smart, she's fun, and we have a great conversation. So if you were ever curious about the quote-unquote talk with your children, your young people about sex and sexuality, I'm really fascinated when we talk about race play. We spend some time on that, but I was more interested in, hopefully my mama won't hear this conversation, and think about how do you talk to young people. Am I normal? How do we define normal? So we talk about that. A young ghetto nerd exploring his sexuality. I don't get too graphic. This is a PG or PG-13 show now. People don't need to know all my business. So we have that conversation. We talk about the Kinsey report too. I had a lot of questions about Kinsey and how that research has been misrepresented in some ways, processed, filtered, and or distorted, or perhaps properly understood in the popular imagination. So Rosalind DeShivo, we have a cool conversation about sex, sexuality, teenagers, new media. We also talk about 50 Shades of Grey. I had to ask about 50 Shades of Grey. We had that conversation too. So that's, I think, going to be one that you all will learn from and enjoy. So you'll get the titillation for some, you'll get snickers and laughs for others, and I hope there'll be some head nodding for other folks saying, yeah, this is going to be helpful in terms of talking to my teenager, in terms of my own life, in terms of thinking about my own sexuality. So that is a cool conversation. As I said, wonderful stuff. All the cool people who we sit down with here on the Chauncey DeVega Show. And as is my closer, as my goodbye always is, if you like what we're doing, if you got the resources, tax day is coming up. There's some ducats or pennies or quarters into the PayPal link on ChaunceyDeVega.com. This does take time. It takes energy, opportunity costs, all that stuff to make this happen. As I said, we're trying to do this every week. At this point, we are on episode, I believe, season 3, episode 14 or so, 15. And we've got a few dozen episodes before that. And you can find us on Stitcher. You can find us on iTunes. Again, please subscribe. Please share with your friends. Mention us on Twitter, Facebook. If you like the show, if you've got any constructive feedback, send a brother email. And you will notice one other change. As I said, we're always evolving here on the Chauncey DeVega Show. So we have our intro where we start. We got a little bumper there. And I've added a little music. right? So we have that break after our opening conversation. Then we transition into the main meal. We have the appetizer and we got the meal and we got a little break in there. So you will be hearing some music there that is free open source music from a great website. I will be giving them a promo in the future. Again, they don't pay me nothing. It's not sponsored. And you'll be hearing that in the future. So if you have any suggestions about bumper music that's free, that's online from up and coming band, perhaps your own band, if you're a DJ, if you make beats, whatever, send it in. I'm always trying to mix that up. So that's a subtle change you're going to hear. So if you can, send us some love. You know how to do that. Hands are open. No shame there. And as I always say, please be good to yourself. Be kind to a stranger. Do something nice for our four-legged, our two-legged, our winged, our reptilian friends. And as I said, really try to do something nice for some of our brothers and sisters who are here out on these mean streets. Give somebody a meal. I never turn somebody down if they ask for food. Downtown here in Chicago, I always try to look out for it. Kind gentleman. He has a beautiful little doggie. She looks just like Toto out of The Wizard of Oz. And I always try to give him some money when I can, on payday, even when not payday. That's my tithing. And I always try to shake his hand, give him some dap. And that human connection, so that our brothers and sisters know they are acknowledged as human beings. That's healing. That's very empowering. And you never know when you're going to learn something from somebody out here on these streets. So please try to do that. Surprise somebody with a random act of kindness, because it is its greatest return and it will make your spirit, your soul feel better too. So it's that sort of, self-interest is a way of motivating selfless behavior. I guess economists would probably agree with that, the question of altruism and rationality. So until next time, you have been listening to the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. Be well, be safe, and be happy. Until next week.